welcome to another episode of Breaking into Cybersecurity. Today we have Tammy Klotz who will be joining us on the podcast, and her expertise is in third-party risk management. So, for those who might not be in cybersecurity, it's really focused on the risk of uh, companies that are in your supply chain, companies that are part of the vendors or suppliers that you work with. They really make up the ecosystem around your organization. Tammy, tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you into cyber to begin with.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris, for the opportunity to be with the audience today. My name is Tammy Klotz, and I am currently the CISO at an organization called Trinseo, which is a chemical manufacturing company. I have been in cyber for the past 10 years now. As the Chief Information Security Officer, not only here at Trinseo, but also at two prior companies, one Versu Materials and another Covanta Energy, which is now rebranded as Reworld. How I got into cyber is really an interesting journey. I spent 24 years in technology, and the last 3 years of that was very much in an internal audit capacity. And we did a cybersecurity assessment of the program at Air Products that I worked at for those 24 years. So that was kind of my first dip into cyber. And then Air Products actually spun off its chemical division, which became Versu Materials. And I had the opportunity to launch in the cyberspace there as the CISO. And a lot of that was founded on my business relationships within the chemicals division of Air Products, as well as that audit experience, the controls mindedness. That was how I got started, and now have been here for almost 10 years.
Wow. So let's think about that transition from audit into your current role. A lot of people think that audit might not be as applicable to some of the cyber roles, but little do they know it really enforces all the technical and administrative and controls that you put around securing the information. So tell us a little bit about that and how you transitioned.
Sure. So yes, when I was tapped on the shoulder to take the role in internal audit, I paused and I was like, ugh. But honestly, it was probably the best thing I could have done from a career perspective, because I had the opportunity to learn a couple of different things. One, as a publicly traded company, what are the things that the board of directors are interested in? What do SOX controls mean and why are they important? So really developing that control-minded philosophy and understanding around why controls are important. Specifically, when you think about things from a user access perspective, as well as a change management perspective. These are all fundamental things that become critically important to your cybersecurity program to ensure your data and your operations are protected, and really being able to build those foundational policies of what makes sense from a need to know basis, as well as, as we get into cyber, talking more about things like zero trust architectures. What are we going to put in place to ensure we do have the proper controls to protect our personal data of our employees, as well as our operational data of our manufacturing, our intellectual property? All of those things become extremely important.
So the other thing that you mentioned was the business relationships that you had with the organization, how critical they were. I think oftentimes people overlook this aspect, especially as you get more advanced in your career. Talk to us about how that was helpful.
So extremely helpful. One, relationships are foundational in the role of the Chief Information Security Officer, right? Because you need to be able to bring with them the level of confidence that's required from a business acumen perspective to ensure and provide the assurances that you do understand what the business operating principles are, what the products are that you're making, what services are you providing. It's going to be different depending upon what industry you're in, but having those business relationships becomes paramount because you want to have a seat at the table. You don't want to be necessarily this technology geek that's sitting around the table with a bunch of business experts. You want to be able to speak their language as well. So that, I believe, is super critical for being successful in this role. And there are definitely people in cybersecurity that are going to be much more technically oriented. But as you said, as you advance in your career and your space, and you're dealing and interacting with much more senior leaders, that is when you want to make sure that you have the balance between the cyber technology, but also then being able to translate that into business terms that folks can understand and appreciate from a risk perspective, from a cost perspective, from an impact perspective.
Now let's start to go into building a good TPRM program. What would you say that the core components of a great TPRM program might be?
Yeah. I would say the first two is, one, knowing who your key third-party partners are that you're working with, that your business is reliant on upon delivering the internal services and products for your organization. So one, knowing who they are, having an accurate inventory, understanding what role those third parties are actually playing for your business. Are they providing consulting services? Are you allowing them to host your data for you? Are you giving them access to key systems? And really understand what role and capacity you're working with those third parties in. The other thing is the processes through which you're actually going to vet those third parties. Are they reputable third parties that you want to do business with, that your organization has a risk tolerance to work with? Do they have the proper security controls in place to ensure that their people, their processes, their infrastructure are properly protecting whatever company information you're sharing with them? So understanding, what their security posture is becomes extremely valuable as you look to share the risk responsibilities of protecting that data.
So you're talking about really understanding the risks you take on with working with any other company. How do you go about assessing that risk and really getting a good basis as to whether you can trust them and they say what, or they're doing what they say and they mean what they say?
Yeah, so a couple of things. If you think of third-party risk management holistically for any business organization, there are going to be a variety of different risks that need to be evaluated when working with a third party, whether that be financial risk, whether that be um, security risks from a data protection perspective. Are there sanctioned risks that are out there that you need to be concerned about as well? So working very closely with, your procurement organizations as well as your legal organizations as you're entertaining doing business with one of these third parties becomes extremely important. And how do you quantify or qualify that risk so folks understand? There's several tools in the industry that can assist with that quantification. However, looking at it from an internal perspective of what data you're sharing in those cases, and what posture the organization is really looking to tolerate in those situations. So risk becomes very important and fundamental to understanding, where you're willing to make trade-offs. So think about things like, are you willing to put personal information in the cloud? Are you willing to put intellectual property in the cloud? And there's going to be, in some cases where the answers to those questions are very different. But if you are going to look to using a software as a service provider, do they have the proper controls in place to make sure? So how do you get that? How do you build that confidence in knowing? There's a couple of different things, right? So one of the things that you definitely want to look for, and in some cases can be a showstopper. But if you're looking at using a software as a service provider and they do not have a SOC 2 Type 2 report, becomes, almost a deal breaker in a lot of cases, because I don't want to encourage business with somebody who hasn't vetted their security controls through a third party and can provide those assurances. The other thing that will typically happen, in addition to either that SOC 2, in some cases, a SOC 2 is a U.S. Specific requirement in a lot of cases. But if you go internationally, you'll want to look at things like an ISO 27001 certification, which also speaks to the security posture policies and procedures of the company. So looking for that type of certification. And then what are the internal questions that you need to ask and understand beyond those two kind of externally verified sources? What are the additional questions? Do you need to have your own questionnaire? There's also standard questionnaires that are out in the industry, specifically around things like cloud security and the CAKE questionnaires that need to be answered. And this is it's a crazy space from a supplier perspective or a vendor perspective, because you can be hit with questionnaires from, every single customer that you're doing business with. So trying to standardize on what the expectations are and the requirements are becomes extremely beneficial. So for suppliers who are getting asked questions about certifications, there becomes a point in time, whereas if you don't have those certifications like the SOC 2, like the ISO, it's going to become detrimental to your business.
So, a question from the audience. Do you feel that there was a failure to properly audit or certify third parties in the case of CrowdStrike? What happened that it was allowed in so many trusted organizations?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and one that has definitely come under scrutiny since the CrowdStrike incident, which my company was personally affected by. So I lived through it. And I think there's a couple of different ways to think about it. From a controls perspective, yes. So in this particular incident, it was a cybersecurity company that I'll say improperly rolled out a bit of software, a channel policy update. And from a control perspective, that is supposed to be tested before it happens. And, so there's a big element of, credibility that CrowdStrike has carried with them through this incident because of their dominance in the market. But it also demonstrates for you, the situation in which something can happen from a human perspective that will obviously be detrimental to the entire customer base. And that is exactly what happened with CrowdStrike. Now, so there was a breakdown in controls from a software release perspective, if you will. So even with the assurances of some of those, bad stuff happens, right? So how you manage that relationship with a vendor like CrowdStrike becomes extremely important. What are the terms and conditions in the contract? What are your service level agreements that you have in place with them? So it also highlights, I think the very interesting thing is that as much as you want to be able to transfer the risk of something like that to an external third party, you cannot 100% do that because you're still accountable for delivering and uptime for your organization. So I can't sit here and go, oh, well, CrowdStrike failed, so therefore, what are we going to do? It's how are you going to recover from that?
your organization also had their own controls to test and verify the software before they released it to their ecosystem. So there's fault to blame on both sides.
Yeah, although with the CrowdStrike model, the push to all is really not necessarily, it's not, it's I would say the typical model was that it went out because that vetting doesn't happen with their model. But yeah, if you did it in such a way that it was orchestrated and such that it only went to a certain population. And I think that's what folks are going to start to think about now post the CrowdStrike incident is, do we need diversity in our environment so it doesn't affect everybody, all servers, all people. How do you segment or stagger your user base, your server base, your solution base, basically?
And that also brings up the question of continuous verification, because a lot of the instruments that you mentioned earlier, questionnaires, surveys, these are static point in time things, but that doesn't mean because they were doing it a year ago or 2 years ago that they're still doing it today. So for your critical vendors, you probably should do something more continuously on a regular basis.
Yeah, so a couple of things I would offer there is one, making sure that you have a risk ranking process in place to understand who your high risk providers are for your organization. And you can throttle that in several different ways. It can be based upon the type of data they have access to. It can be the amount of revenue that we're generating as a result of that company that we're doing business. How critical are they to our supply chain? You mentioned that early on, or in other instances on the reverse, how critical are we to our customers' supply chain as well? Because you can kind of be on the other side of this equation as well. So understanding that risk ranking becomes extremely important. And obviously, many of us do business with a lot of third parties, so you can't do the same rigor across the entire fleet of vendors that you're doing business with. So having that risk ranking is in place, and then understanding what your monitoring is going to be. What is your threshold? What is your frequency? Are you monitoring those high risk providers on a continuous basis? And there's services out there that you can buy, to help you with a data point I'll talk to it from like a cybersecurity scoring perspective. And that can sometimes be your trigger, that if there's a score that has changed significantly, what happened? Why did it happen? What are they doing about it? How are they reacting to it? So that can help with your continuous monitoring efforts and your notification thereof. And then how do you make sure on that annual basis, as those SOC 2s are expiring, are you getting a bridge letter? Are you getting the updated SOC 2 when it's available? Those are the types of things that you need to make sure of that are in check from a process perspective, especially for those high risk providers.
So in large companies, enterprises that usually have dedicated person like yourself or a dedicated team for TPRM, they probably have hundreds, if not thousands, of suppliers and vendors to go through. Is there any sort of automation that can be used to kind of go through this on a regular basis, or is it still a fairly manual process?
I think at this point, it's still a fairly manual process. I think once you get through the onboarding of a new vendor and you have them being tracked through your systems, the automation around it's time for review, it's time to request, and the automation of those work processes. I think where there's opportunity going forward is how you conduct the review once all the new materials have been received. Where are the deficiencies? Have there been new deficiencies that have been reported? And the understanding of how the company is or is not handling those. I think there's room for automation there. I don't think we're quite there yet, but But as AI continues to expand and those reports are more formalized and more standardized, that may be something. I know there's other companies that are out there that are really looking to kind of assist with this process as well. So that if you don't have the internal staff to kind of stay up to date on all of it, you can buy a service from somebody who's going to help you do this as well. There's a couple out there, Wistic and others, that are doing that type of service offering with a kind of a catalog of vetted vendors already.
Yeah, I've talked to a couple myself. I think it's called Viso Trust, and what they do is they ingest all the artifacts, like you mentioned, the SOC 2 and other things. Use both artificial intelligence and humans to validate what controls they meet, and then you can scale that across all the other vendors if you're on the supplier side, and then vice versa. But you're right. There's a lot of potential for AI to help in this, but I think when it comes to using AI, we have to understand what's the intended output, what sort of inputs do we need, and then how do we validate that it's really giving us the responses that we're looking for. We talked a lot about a TPRM for a large program. How could smaller companies potentially implement a scalable program, small, medium-sized companies maybe?
Yeah, I think as you scale down, like the things that you want to think about is really developing that risk profile, right? Who are the top vendors that I'm going to focus on, right? And then I think figuring out what the risk criteria are and what those vendors actually have access to, that will become extremely clear. And then I think what you need to do is really rationalize how you're going to vet them, right? So if you're a smaller company and you're doing things that are, cloud-based, the rule is we don't do business with them unless they do have a SOC 2 type 2, right? Again, it's still a point in time. I understand that, but that's definitely, a reputable document from an assurance perspective that can help. And then making sure that, you're focused on those high risks. It's just a matter of how much is tolerable from a risk tolerance perspective for your organization, and applying the right level of scrutiny to those top vendors as well. So I think it's about identifying the high risk and then minimizing what you're willing to compromise or what you're willing to accept from an evidence or assurance perspective.
And now for practitioners, for those maybe more junior in their career, how could they get into TPRM? And we'll focus on the leaders next.
We'll focus on what, Chris? I missed that last part.
Let's start with junior folks, and then we can focus on more senior folks and leaders after.
Yeah. So how do you break into the TPRM space, right? I think one of the things is to really spend a bit of time understanding what those external certifications bring to the table. So getting started may actually being part of the process to complete or conduct an ISO 27001 assessment, a gap assessment, and then working with a team who can actually help you perform the certification process. I think that's an interesting way to kind of get started in the space. And you can typically do that not so much from a cybersecurity organization perspective, but from one of those audit organizations that is actually handing out the certificates that are in that space, because that'll give you more inside knowledge to what it takes, right? And then, if you're, I do believe that audit is a really good launch pad for a cyber career, specifically for somebody who's very controls minded or looking at it from a compliance perspective. That will give you good foundational breadth around the different types of things that we're concerned about from a security perspective. I think, other things from a getting started perspective is really, focusing a little bit more on kind of the risk side of the organization. A lot of cyber, if you're not doing, hardcore technology, penetration testing, those types of things of cyber, if you're looking at it more from a governance, risk, and compliance perspectives, which is where typically where TPRM has been placed in my programs across the three companies, really looking at it from, a risk focus and understanding business impact as a result of risk and where the company's risk tolerance. So I think those are some of more of the maybe more non-traditional ways to get started from a TPRM perspective. I think the other thing is really to spend some time within a procurement organization, right? Really understanding what procurement is doing to vet vendors that their company, because they're looking at it from a different lens, right? Is this company financially stable? Where we're saying, have they had a breach before? Do they have these controls in place? And really developing a relationship there, I think would be helpful. And then also, I describe TPRM really as a three-legged stool between security, legal, and procurement. So if you can, get some some basis and understanding in those fundamental processes from a legal, whether that's privacy, whether that's contractual terms, those types of things, and then working with procurement. I think those are, a couple of other maybe non-traditional ways to break into the TPRM space.
Now, for leaders that might have already established themselves, leading a team, maybe in IT, maybe in security, but they want to get into the TPRM field because they see that it's advancing and there's a lot of innovation over there. How would they transition over and use the skills that they have to demonstrate that they can achieve that role?
So moving into a leadership role around TPRM. So a couple of things that I would suggest as you advance through the ranks, I'll say, is working with your business partners in your other organizations, but understanding kind of the entire ecosystem from supplier to customer and how that's actually working. I'm coming up a little bit short here on some ideas with regards to how to build out the leadership componentry to it. But I think, it's going to be a lot of basis on understanding the work processes that are in place, the business processes that are supporting it, and really being able to explain business impact as a result of doing business with a third party. I think the other thing that tends to get married with the role in some cases is just vendor management in holistically, right? So whether that's a contract management perspective, a contract renewal perspective, and then adding in the security piece of it, making sure that they're, et cetera. So at my last company, we actually had, I had an individual on my team who was really responsible for the third-party security risk management component, but they worked very closely with the vendor manager to onboard a new vendor, to do the risk assessment, and actually writing the report that got sent back to the requester, whether the recommendation was to do business or not do business with that organization. So from a leader perspective there, if you think about it from an approval perspective of being able to read through what the team has put together from a risk assessment process and then applying the discipline and the business rationale of whether it makes good business sense to work with them, and then offering that to the individuals who had actually requested it.
Are there any educational programs or certifications that you've seen that have been helpful in giving an individual a good breadth of what to expect in this field?
So I think, there's some training that is available through SANS, obviously, that are very much focused in this area. I think if you look at things from like that are available in Cloud Security Alliance with regards to, what are the controls that need to be in place from a posture perspective, I think those can be helpful. And then I think honestly, some of the certifications that are available through ISACA that are very risk focused. So if you look at a C risk cert, or if you look at a CISM or a CISA certification, those would also be beneficial to somebody who's very much focused from a third party perspective. Um, I'm trying to think of, and I also believe that there's some value that would come out of like a CompTIA security cert, because that's more, foundational, and this would be one of the topics that would be covered in there.
Well, we've already hit our 30 minutes, and it's just flown by so quickly. Any final advice that you would give for professionals in the TPRM space?
I think the one thing that's really important, especially for those of you who are in organizations that are publicly traded organizations, one of the things that happened last year with the introduction of the new SEC reporting requirements in the event of a cyber incident, that third party component to that equation is pretty big. So you need to be able to demonstrate the fact that you've done the proper due diligence and vetting your third parties that your organization is reliant on. So, this isn't, just a thing that we have to do internally, but there are some reporting requirements that come with it. So, heed that for what it's worth and what you need to do, and be familiar with that. And really, this is about, again, I believe understanding the business and what the business relies on. And don't forget about those vendors that are not like typical IT vendors, right? Who are, SaaS providers, but look at it from the context of who are we giving access to our systems to? And I hate to go back to the Target breach, but it definitely is one that resonates, right? Because, the HVAC company, but why am I going to worry about them, right? But they had access and were able to get their way in and made their way to the point of sale system, maybe unknowingly, but they did, and it didn't turn out very well from that perspective. And I think along these lines, think about it in the reverse, right? In a lot of cases, we are also third parties that are providing services to our customers. So you have to be able to pass the red face test with regards to, I'm asking somebody to do this for me. I have to be able to turn around and do the same thing for my customers if they're looking for that validation, that as a result of them working with me or being reliant on me and my company for a raw material, perhaps in a lot of situations, what happens if I can't supply them? Because now I'm critical. I'm a critical third party to them. So you need to be able to spin the hat and really, pass the red face test that you're doing the same things that you're expecting your suppliers to do for your organization.
But I'd also add that SolarWinds was an example of that as well on the IT side.
Sure, absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
CrowdStrike and others. But well, thank you so much for coming on, Tammy. Really appreciate it. Can folks find you anywhere if they have questions to ask? Where's
Sure.
best to find you?
Yeah, the best place is on LinkedIn. It's, search me. You'll see my picture. The name is out there. It's just as it appears on the screen right now. So that's definitely where I would encourage everybody to go to.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and everyone have a great rest of your day. And thank you for joining us on Breaking into Cybersecurity.
All right, Chris, thank you.